Welcome to The Explainer. Right now, the UK is caught in a massive, high-stakes tug-of-war, and it's a fascinating situation. We're going to dive right into the deep end of the tension between tightening border policies and the everyday reality of the economy. We'll be looking at the latest data, policy assessments, and frontline reports to figure out what happens when strict political priorities collide with severe labor shortages. Ultimately, we really want to unpack what this friction means for the essential services we all rely on and how it's impacting social cohesion in local communities. So let's look at the core paradox we're dealing with today. On one side, you've got a very clear, mandated political goal: drastically reduce net migration into the UK. But on the exact opposite side, you have an immediate economic reality, which is record labor shortages in essential sectors like healthcare, agriculture, and hospitality. So the really crucial question becomes, how on earth does a country reconcile the promises made by politicians with the desperate practical needs of its actual workforce? Here's our roadmap for making sense of all this. First, we'll look at the migration policy shift. Second, the workforce reality. Third, how this is leading to rising rhetoric and division. And finally, the domestic upskilling gamble. All right, diving straight into Section 1, the migration policy shift and the drive to shrink the numbers. To really grasp the sheer scale of the policy shift happening right now, you have to understand this staggering number: 906,000. According to official data, that was the record high peak of UK net migration in the year ending June 2023. I mean, that is a fourfold increase in under 4 years. It's essentially adding a population larger than the entire city of Leeds. And what's really fascinating is what this number triggered. It set off an intense political backlash across the entire spectrum, leading to widespread public demand and a really strict political mandate to bring those numbers down. And man, that reduction is happening incredibly fast. Just listen to Professor Brian Bell, who's an independent advisor to the government. Because of new restrictions, net migration is expected to plummet to around 200,000 by 2026. Some economic forecasters are actually suggesting it could go even further. With the sheer volume of people being denied visa extensions, the net figure could theoretically hit zero for the first time since 1993. That is a massive demographic swing in a very, very short amount of time. So, how exactly are they slamming on the brakes? Well, mostly through the spring 2025 immigration rules. The government basically went in and hiked up the salary thresholds required for skilled worker visas. They completely banned the overseas recruitment of new care workers on health and care visas, and they closed early clearance for senior care roles. The ultimate aim across the board here is crystal clear: tie the immigration system strictly to skills and make absolutely sure that no industry can just rely solely on overseas recruitment to fill its gaps. Which brings us right to Section 2, the workforce reality. Basically, what happens to the engine of the economy when you suddenly cut off that supply of labor? Let's look at the direct data from the Home Office. When we track the count of skilled workers by industry, the sectors relying the absolute most on these visas are accommodation and food service and health and social work. We're talking about the fundamental frontline industries: your local hospitals, care homes, restaurants. They have become structurally dependent on international recruitment. So when policymakers pull the lever to reduce migration, these are the industries taking the immediate direct hit. Let's break down exactly what that pressure looks like. In health and social care, an unbelievable 161,000 skilled worker visas were granted to non-EU care workers leading up to 2025. Now that those routes are restricted, surveys are showing 2/3 of NHS nurses believe staff shortages are actively putting patients at risk. In agriculture, the reliance on seasonal labor is so intense that with new visa caps, 1 in 12 dairy farms are actively having to reduce their production. Hospitality is facing the exact same struggle. The cold, hard reality is that these sectors simply cannot function at their current capacity without this labor force. But wait, because it actually gets even more complicated. You might assume that as overseas recruitment gets squeezed, domestic workers would just step right in to fill the void, right? Well, labor market participation by UK residents has actually fallen. In early 2025, the employment rate for 16 to 64-year-olds dropped to 75%, which dips it below pre-pandemic levels. So employers are essentially caught in a vice right now. The international door is being closed, and the domestic talent pool is actually shrinking. Now, this intense friction between policy and economic reality doesn't just stay neatly tucked away in spreadsheets. Let's move to Section 3, rising rhetoric and division, and see how this actually impacts the social fabric. You can really feel the tension on the ground. Take a listen to this quote from a healthcare worker shared by the union Unison. They said, "We face a system that sometimes makes us feel like we're needed but not really wanted.
How can the NHS depend on migrant workers while migrant workers are made to feel disposable? I think that perfectly highlights the severe alienation felt by the exact people holding essential public services together. They are caught perfectly in the middle, economically essential yet feeling politically targeted. And on the flip side of that experience is a media and political landscape that's becoming intensely polarized. An investigation by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism made this observation. Whether it's the so-called small boats crisis, the spread of disinformation online, or protests against asylum hotels, the message right now is clear. If you're not from the UK, you're the problem. They're reporting on the rise of what they call a hate economy that's actively fracturing social cohesion. It draws a really direct line between top-down public rhetoric and rising division in our communities. And the sources outline how we're seeing this play out in real time. There's been a noticeable rise in massive Unite the Kingdom rallies clashing with counter-protests. We're seeing the documented weaponization of local crime stories to deliberately spread anti-migrant fear online. Polling shows 67% of Britons genuinely believe immigration levels are currently too high. And making all of this so much worse is a massive surge in AI-generated disinformation designed specifically to fuel community divisions for profit. The macro-level debate over visas is no longer just a debate in Parliament. It's heavily influencing the reality of daily interactions in diverse local neighborhoods. So how on earth does the UK government plan to navigate out of this deeply divided, economically strained situation? That brings us to our final section, the domestic upskilling gamble. When you look at their long-term strategy, it's essentially a massive, high-stakes gamble to force a transition. Step 1, restrict access to overseas labor, cutting off the easy supply. Step 2, introduce policies like fair pay agreements to basically force wages up and make these difficult jobs actually attractive to locals. Step 3, heavily incentivized employers to train and upskill the domestic workforce. And finally, Step 4, achieve long-term, self-sustaining productivity growth. They are forcefully trying to break the nation's cycle of reliance on migration. But make no mistake, the trade-off here is absolutely huge. Economists project the short-term pain is going to include an immediate £6 to £8 billion shortfall in public finances simply because fewer high-earning migrants are paying taxes, and that's alongside acute crises in hospitals and on farms. The government is essentially betting the house that this severe short-term shock is entirely worth the long-term payoff, building a high-wage, high-skilled domestic economy that can actually stand on its own 2 feet. Which really leaves us with the million-dollar question. Can domestic upskilling actually outpace the immediate workforce crisis? Are employers going to invest in training fast enough to save our essential services? Or will this immense friction tear at the economic and social fabric of the UK before those benefits are ever realized? It's an incredibly delicate balancing act with very real human consequences on all sides. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Definitely keep an eye on this data because this story is far from over.